Something is happening right now across the global computing landscape, whose scale the technology press's occasional Linux mention consistently underrepresents as the niche curiosity, rather than the mass movement whose momentum, the actual download statistics, the actual forum membership growth, and the actual Steam survey's monthly Linux percentage increase together document as the accelerating departure from the platform whose monopoly the personal computing era established as the unquestioned default, and whose grip the accumulated grievances of the forced update, the hardware abandonment, the subscriptional creep, and the surveillance normalization have collectively loosened to the degree that the word exodus, not migration, not experiment, not curiosity, is the accurate description of what is currently happening to Microsoft's user base as the present reality, rather than the predicted future whose arrival the Linux community has anticipated across the decades of the patient waiting, whose end, the specific convergence of the specific pressures, has finally delivered as the inflection point whose crossing the numbers confirm as the statistical finding, rather than the advocacy's wishful characterization. Microsoft just ended support for Windows 10. Let that land with the weight it deserves. Not the abstract weight of the technical announcement whose implications the press release's corporate language softens as the managed transition, but the concrete weight of the specific number that represents the actual human scale of this decision. There are currently over 240 million computers running Windows 10 that Microsoft has officially declared as the abandoned hardware, not broken hardware, not slow hardware, not hardware whose functional inadequacy the user's computing experience documents as the genuine limitation. Functional, working, capable computers whose only disqualification from the Windows 11 upgrade, the TPM 2.0 requirement or the processor compatibility list's exclusion, creates as the artificial barrier whose purpose the cynical interpretation identifies as the hardware sales stimulus, and whose effect the honest measurement documents as the 240 million users facing the choice between buying nay, home hardware they do not need, paying for extended security updates that should be free, accepting the security vulnerability of the unsupported system's continued operation, or discovering that the computer Microsoft declared obsolete runs Linux as the fully supported, actively developed, completely free operating system whose installation transforms the abandoned hardware into the capable modern machine. Millions chose Linux, and millions more are choosing it every single day that this reality continues, as the unresolved situation Microsoft created as the business decision, whose user impact the corporate calculation did not wait as the primary consideration. The exodus is not the single cause story. The Windows abandonment, whose scale the current numbers document as the mass movement, has the multiple causes whose convergence the specific timeline maps as the compounding pressure accumulation, rather than the single breaking point whose identification. The simple narrative prefers as the satisfying explanation. Microsoft did not lose these users in a single day with a single decision. Microsoft lost these users through the patient accumulation of the decisions, whose individual irritation the user absorbed as the tolerable annoyance, and whose collective weight the final insult, the hardware abandonment letter disguised as the system requirement, transformed from the tolerable annoyance into the departure motivation, whose execution the Linux installation enables as the immediately available alternative. The advertising whose appearance inside the Windows 11 operating system the paying user encounters as the Start menu recommendation, the File Explorer banner, and the Settings panel promotion, together deliver as the commercial interruption whose presence in the operating system the user purchased represents the specific relationship redefinition that Microsoft performed without the explicit announcement whose honest communication would have described the transaction's new terms as the exchange in which the license fee purchases not the clean computing environment, but the subsidized experience, whose advertising revenue the Microsoft business model supplements the license revenue with as the additional monetization whose user experience cost the corporate accounting does not record as the liability. The user who paid for Windows and received advertisements inside Windows experienced the relationship's betrayal as the personal affront whose emotional character, the rational analysis of the business model's logic, does not diminish as the understandable corporate decision, because the betrayal's experience is not the rational evaluation of the business decision, but the visceral recognition that the operating system you paid for is treating you as the product rather than the customer. That recognition, multiplied across the millions of users whose Windows 11 experienced the advertising's presence defined as the monetized environment, produced the departure motivation whose Linux destination, the free, advertisement-free alternative, provides as the immediate remedy. The OneDrive, whose aggressive promotion the Windows setup process performs as the default configuration, whose opt-out the buried settings menu requires, as the deliberate resistance. The Microsoft account, whose requirement the Windows 11 installation demands as the local account's increasingly difficult alternative, the Edge browser, whose restoration Windows Update performs after the user's Chrome or Firefox installation as the default browser's reclamation, and the Teams, whose Windows integration Microsoft pursued as the productivity suite's bundled imposition. These are not the isolated product decisions whose individual character the separate evaluation considers as the independent choices. These are the components of the platform lock-in strategy, whose systematic implementation the user experiences as the operating system that continuously attempts to expand Microsoft's control over the computing experience beyond the operating system's boundaries, into the application, the browser, the cloud storage, and the communication tool, whose alternatives, the Windows integration's friction disadvantages, as the inferior experience by the design whose intent the friction's direction reveals as the competitive strategy, rather than the user experience optimization. The user, who recognizes the strategy's operation, stops tolerating the friction as the accepted cost, and starts evaluating the alternative as the escape from the strategy's designed constraints. The telemetry, whose Windows 10 introduction Microsoft framed as the diagnostic improvement, and whose scope the honest technical investigation documents as the comprehensive behavioral surveillance, whose data collection the operating system performs as the continuous background operation, represents the privacy dimension of the Windows exodus, whose significance the growing privacy consciousness of the global user population establishes as the departure motivation, whose emotional resonance the abstract data point's impersonal character belies as the surprisingly personal discovery. The specific moment when the network monitoring tool's display of the Windows installation's outbound connections reveals the frequency, the volume, and the destination of the data. The operating system transmits as the background communication produces in the user who witnesses this monitoring the specific reaction that the privacy policy's legal language never produces as the equivalent emotional response, because the legal language describes the permission abstractly, while the network monitor shows the behavior concretely as the happening in real time on the user's own machine. The concrete showing produced the departure motivation for more users than the Linux advocacy's rational privacy argument ever converted, because the evidence's personal immediacy communicates what the argument's abstract logic cannot deliver as the equivalent motivational force. Linux caught these departing users at the precise moment when Linux's readiness to receive them had reached the threshold the previous waves of the Windows frustration never encountered as the available destination. The Linux desktop's decade-long maturation, the hardware compatibility's systematic improvement, the gaming capability's proton-driven transformation, and the user experience's refinement, whose cumulative progress, the individual release's incremental character, concealed as the modest advancement, but whose accumulated depth, the version comparison across the 5-year span reveals as the platform transformation. This maturation arrived at the reception-ready state at exactly the moment when the Windows 10 end-of-support announcement delivered the 240 million potential converts as the motivated audience whose departure the platform was finally prepared to receive as the capable alternative, rather than the enthusiast experiment, whose rough edges the average user's tolerance threshold could not accommodate as the acceptable daily experience. The Steam Deck changed everything in a way that the Linux community's advocacy never could have achieved as the argument's persuasive power. The handheld gaming device, whose operating system the SteamOS Linux Foundation provides as the invisible infrastructure, delivered the proof-of-concept demonstration to the audience that the Linux advocacy's technical arguments consistently failed to reach as the receptive population. The gamers, whose Windows attachment the gaming library's compatibility requirement cemented as the platform dependency, whose dissolution the Linux gaming capabilities theoretical improvement could assert, but whose practical demonstration the Steam Deck's living room presence provided as the daily evidence. The gamer who plays the Windows gaming library on the Steam Deck's Linux operating system without the compatibility friction, whose existence the theoretical Linux gaming discussion predicted as the persistent barrier, discovers in the practical experience the evidence that the barrier's dissolution has progressed further than the assumption's outdated characterization represented as the current state. That discovery, multiplied across the millions of Steam Deck units whose shipment valve has accumulated as the installed base, produced the gaming population's Linux familiarity, whose expansion the desktop Linux migration's subsequent consideration benefits from as the reduced intimidation threshold. The Ubuntu download statistics, whose public availability the canonical reporting provides as the partial visibility into the Linux adoption scale, the Linux Mint forums membership growth, whose trajectory the community's own documentation records as the accelerating curve, and the Reddit communities, whose R-Linux and R-Linux Master Race membership numbers the platform's public statistics display as the growing populations, whose expansion the Windows frustration's peaks correlate with as the departure and arrival pattern. These are the measurement instruments whose imperfect but directional reading the honest assessment uses as the available evidence for the mass movement's characterization rather than the precise quantification whose methodology, the distributed Linux distribution model's absence of the centralized installation tracking, makes the unavailable measurement. The distribution happens across the hundreds of Linux distributions, whose individual download servers, the centralized counting mechanism, does not aggregate as the unified statistic, which means the Linux adoption's actual scale systematically exceeds the available measurement's partial capture as the documented portion of the undocumented whole. The enterprise dimension of the Windows exodus, whose mainstream coverage the consumer narrative's dominance consistently underreports, as the secondary story, is the dimension whose scale the corporate Linux adoption's acceleration documents as the significant parallel movement. The company whose Windows licensing costs the annual budget calculation records as the per-seat expense, whose multiplication across the employee population produces the 6-figure or 7-figure annual payment, whose elimination the Linux deployment achieves as the immediate cost reduction, evaluates the Linux migration not as the ideological preference, but as the financial decision whose return on investment the license costs elimination against the migration costs investment produces as the favorable calculation. The municipal government, whose German city's Linux deployment the press covered as the idealistic experiment in the early 2000s, has become the template whose replication the European public sector's Microsoft cost and sovereignty concern motivates as the practical policy rather than the principled statement. The enterprise exodus runs parallel to the consumer exodus as the separate movement whose combined scale the individual story's focus misses as the aggregate finding. The Linux distribution ecosystem's response to the influx of the Windows experienced users, arriving as the motivated migrants rather than the technically adventurous experimenters, has been the user experience investment whose evidence the recent distribution releases document as the design priority, whose elevation above the technical capabilities' exclusive focus represents the community's recognition that the reception-ready platform, the Windows frustrations timing delivered to, requires the continuation of the interface polish, the hardware detection improvement, and the installation simplicity whose standard the Windows experienced user's expectation establishes as the minimum acceptable threshold rather than the aspirational target. Linux Mint's Cinnamon. Desktop, whose familiar taskbar and familiar application menu the Windows expatriate recognizes as the comfortable orientation. Ubuntu's GNOME Desktop, whose modern interface the Windows 11 refugee encounters as the capable alternative, and the Pop! OS, whose elementary refinement the design-conscious migrant discovers as the polished environment together constitute the reception infrastructure whose quality the Exodus's successful completion depends on as the destination's adequacy for the arriving population's retention. The learning curve, whose honest acknowledgement the Linux advocacy's enthusiastic reception narrative sometimes sacrifices as the inconvenient complexity that the simplified story excludes as the discouraging detail, is the reality whose presence the Exodus's honest account cannot omit as the accurate characterization of the transition, whose completion the arriving user's experience includes as the genuine challenge rather than the manufactured obstacle whose Linux critical framing the advocacy's defensive response dismisses as the FUD. There are applications that do not run on Linux. There is hardware that does not work with Linux drivers. There is muscle, memory that the new environment's different behavior frustrates, as the relearning requirement whose duration the individual's specific dependency depth determines as the variable investment. The Exodus's honesty requires these acknowledgments as the accurate preparation whose provision serves the arriving user better than the frictionless promise, whose disappointment the specific incompatibilities discovery delivers as the trust-damaging surprise that the honest preparation would have prevented as the anticipated challenge rather than the unexpected failure. The Windows community's response to the Exodus, whose acknowledgement Microsoft's public actions reveal as the recognized threat requiring the competitive response, has produced the specific concessions, whose appearance in the subsequent Windows releases the user pressure's causal attribution credits as the departure motivation's corrective influence, the advertising's partial reduction in certain Windows configurations, the local account options preservation as the technically available alternative whose discovery the buried setting enables as the deliberate resistance, and the Windows 10 extended support option whose provision the 240 million user abandonment's political, pressure motivated as the damage control measure together demonstrate that the Exodus's scale communicates the leverage whose exercise the departing user performs as the market signal whose reception the platform's response confirms as the competitive pressure's acknowledged existence. The users who left created the conditions that improved the experience for the users who stayed, which is the paradoxical consequence of the departure whose benefit the remaining user receives as the indirect dividend of the departed user's exit motivation. The future, whose trajectory the Exodus's current momentum projects as the directional finding rather than the precise prediction, whose accuracy the complex system's nonlinear development resists as the overconfident forecast, is the future in which the Linux desktop's share of the global computing environment continues the growth, whose acceleration the Windows 10 end-of-support deadline's 240 million user confrontation initiated as the departure catalyst. The artificial intelligence integration, whose Linux ecosystem's development pace the open source model enables as the community innovation rather than the corporate roadmap's scheduled delivery, the hardware compatibilities continued. Improvement, whose systematic progress the driver development's sustained investment produces as the expanding coverage, and the application ecosystem's growth, whose web applications platform agnostic deployment increasingly supplements the native application's platform dependency as the compatibility barrier's dissolution. These are the forces whose combination the Linux future's optimistic assessment identifies as the adoption acceleration's continuation, rather than the plateau's approaching arrival. The Exodus is not the revolution's announcement. The revolution already happened. It happened in the data center a decade ago when Linux became the server operating system whose deployment the enterprise computing's scale validates as the reliable foundation. It happened in the mobile device when Android's Linux kernel became the smartphone's invisible infrastructure whose user population the global mobile computing's scale measures in the billions. It happened in the cloud when the virtual machine's Linux instance became the default deployment environment whose AWS and Google Cloud and Azure statistics confirm as the dominant workload. The desktop's Linux adoption, whose current acceleration the Windows Exodus represents, is not the revolution's beginning. It is the revolution's completion across the final frontier of the Linux deployment's historical gap. The personal computing desktop, whose Windows monopoly, the server, the mobile, and the cloud Linux adoption surrounding success, finally pressures as the isolated holdout whose position the converging forces have made untenable as the permanent arrangement. Millions are switching. The number grows every month. The Windows 10 deadline accelerates the growth. The Steam Deck normalizes the experience. The privacy awareness motivates the investigation. The advertising intrusion provides the final insult. The hardware abandonment delivers the ultimatum. And Linux stands at the other side of the decision as the operating system that costs nothing, surveils nothing, abandons nothing, and delivers the computing experience whose quality the Windows comparison's honest measurement does not favor as the demonstrably superior platform in every dimension, but whose freedom, whose performance, whose cost, and whose respect for the user's time and privacy together constitute the value proposition whose reception the millions of departing Windows users are currently validating as the sufficient motivation for the single installation decision that permanently changes the relationship between the user and the computer. The Exodus is not the story of Linux winning. The Exodus is the story of millions of users deciding that they deserve better. Linux is simply what better looks like when the decision is finally made. And right now, more people are making that decision than at any previous moment in the history of personal computing. The Windows Exodus is not coming. The Windows Exodus is here, and the number of people who will never go back grows by thousands every single day.